Hi, I'm new to Reddit, but I don't really know where else to ask, since I've exhausted asking other neighbours and family in the area. I live in a suburb of Toledo, Ohio. I was on vacation with a friend down in Florida for the past 2 weeks, and we had a neighbour taking care of our dog. We don't live in the best area, with a lot of residents of this complex engaged in selling things that they shouldn't be selling probably. But it's still a pretty tight-knit and chilled community. I had no problem handing over my keys to this person. When I got home, my dog was fine, but I found my neighbour's stuff by the dumpster. I assumed he'd gotten busted for something. Nothing paranormal about that. People come, people go. On this floor alone, there have been 2 eviction notices shoved indoors, and another 2 on the floors below us. It's just not uncommon for people to be here one day and gone the next, either to county or because things are getting too hot. What scared the hell out of me, though, was the state of my apartment. When we'd left, we'd cleaned everything, and I do mean everything. I came back to find dishes in the sink, trash in the can, including some odd items, and our stove and countertops all dirty. Squatters, maybe? But nothing of value was missing. My $1,700 plus gaming machine and display were there, my large flat screen was still there, and firearms were still there. Any squatters would have at least grabbed the Xbox and the guns to pawn. So later on we got to the meat of it. We have several dry eraser boards around the place. I have some cognitive issues that mess with my memory sometimes, so we write lots of notes, appointments, shopping times and lists, who is where and so on. All of these had been erased and replaced with drawings or symbols. My roommate is sleeping on the couch right now, but I will post photos when they go to work. I have no idea what is going on. I mean, I guess it's possible that the neighbour had drawn all this stuff and used our kitchen and bathroom, but he didn't seem like the type to have left it in such a state. We have a mutual respect. I sure as hell wouldn't go to his place and draw on his whiteboards and leave dishes in the sink and then vanish. Besides, he wasn't staying here. He was only coming in to let the dog out a few times a day and put food and water in his dish. But then that gets me thinking. Depending on when he moved out or was busted, he might not have been feeding my dog at all. Whoever was using my stuff might have been taking care of them, all the while drawing weird shit on my whiteboards. I don't know, maybe I'm nuts. I don't really want to call the cops given where I live, but this is some weird stuff. In southern Tennessee, close to Chattanooga, there is a road called Shipley Hollow Road. Going into my story, I did not know about the legend of Pity Pat or the history of Shipley Hollow. If you haven't heard of Pity Pat or are familiar with the area, Google has some good information on the legend. I was dating someone who lived close by at the time, and we had decided we wanted to go ghost hunting one night. He brought this up because there is a graveyard and it was in the middle of nowhere. One night my boyfriend at the time, myself and his cousin Jacob, had decided we wanted to go ghost hunting. I lived in Murfreesboro, about 2 hours north, so they suggested we go to Shipley Hollow. As soon as we had discussed this, my dog started acting strangely, growling at the doorway when no one was there, and pacing and whining. I, of course, already had an uneasy feeling about this place. We got in my car and started the 30-minute drive to the graveyard. The whole drive there I felt very uncomfortable, like someone was watching us, almost a sense of dread. We turned onto an old road and began our drive up Shipley Hollow Road. About halfway up is a bridge that goes over a stream. I stopped the car so we could get out and look at the water, and Jacob said he wanted to get in. The bridge was probably 10 to 15 feet from the stream, so it would have been a bit of a hike down. I automatically said no and asked him to get back in the car. He didn't respond and my boyfriend had to literally drag him back in. It was like he was hypnotized or something. So we got to the graveyard and I parked the car. The graveyard, from what I remember, since it was at least 10 years ago, had a gravel road running through it, so when we got out of the car there would be graves on either side of us. I turned the car off, flicked off the lights, and the 3 of us got out of the car. We were talking and moving the flashlight around, reading the carvings on the gravestones, when all of a sudden we hear a blood-curdling scream. It was one of those moments when you feel as though you imagined it, because of how cliché it was. Jacob continued talking, and I heard it again. It was faint, like it was far off in the woods. I yelled at Jacob to stop talking, and that's when we heard it for the third time, but this time it sounded much closer. The screams were quite terrifying, and it sounded like a woman screaming bloody murder. They lasted maybe 3 to 4 seconds. All three of us ran back to the car, flipping the lights on, and sped the hell out of there. After that, some really weird things started happening. I'd wake up feeling like someone was staring at me from the corner of my boyfriend's bedroom. We'd hear voices when we were the only ones in his house. Cabinets and doors would open by themselves. A shampoo bottle flew across the bathroom when I was showering one morning, and this was a new house in a new neighbourhood as well. It got so bad that his parents hired paranormal investigators to come in and check it out. We broke up shortly after, and they ended up moving house. I haven't noticed anything since leaving the house, but I was wondering if anyone else had ever visited Shipley Hollow, or had something follow them home from somewhere. Later on, we did do some research on the area, and we found out that a few people had drowned in that stream, and many other people have felt as though the stream was calling to them. This really creeped me out when thinking about how Jacob had acted at the bridge. This happened to me when I was about 12 years old. I was at my grandmother's house playing with my cousins. My grandmother lived deep in the woods at the time, so a favourite pastime of ours was to explore the woods, picking wild berries and eating them as we went. I was with 2 of my cousins. We'll call them Sarah and Caleb. Sarah was my age, and her brother Caleb was just a year younger. We walked further than we had ever walked before, breaking our grandmother's rule to not stray further than she could see us, but she was inside and we were dumb kids. After about 30 minutes of walking and running, I suddenly noticed that the woods were now eerily silent. It had somehow happened gradually, though, enough not to spook us with the sudden change, but it still felt wrong, to me at least. If Sarah and Caleb had felt the same way, they didn't say it. Shortly after I noticed the silence, we came to a clearing in the woods. It looked like something out of a storybook. The sun was coming in through the trees around and over the grass that was just a little too green, and it looked enticingly soft. The kind of grass you'd want to feel on your bare feet, or even lay down in for a while. That in and of itself is weird, because this was a very sandy area. Grass didn't really grow well here, and when it did, it was scratchy and brown. But aside from that, this grass didn't look wild. It looked like a manicured lawn, like someone was coming to cut and water it regularly. But the closest house was our grandmother's. No one else was around. And if there were, who would take the time and effort to tend a patch of grass in the middle of the woods? Aside from the grass, there were butterflies just floating around and scattered flowers. It looked and felt like a completely different place juxtaposed into the dry, sandy woods. Like the type of place that everything that grows there is either dry and brown, covered in thorns, or both. It looked like something meant to entice and make you want to stay. We were all 3 good Christian kids, raised not to believe in anything besides Jesus and the Bible, but we could just tell we shouldn't have been here, and we shouldn't walk beyond the trees and into this clearing. We ran with absolutely no discussion. All 3 of us turned and ran as fast as we could. The weirdest thing was it took us 30 minutes to get there. We were energetic kids having fun, so it's not like we were taking our sweet time walking there. But within a minute we were stumbling back into our grandmother's yard. We ran to get my older brother, who was 15 at the time, and show him, but the place had completely vanished. It just didn't exist anymore. I wasn't young enough to have imagined it and convinced myself it was real, and I have 2 witnesses with the same story. Also, a fun little fact about this place. My grandmother told us when she first moved here to never answer a voice we recognized if that person shouldn't be around, especially if they use our name. She also set up code words with Sarah and Caleb, as she was raising them at the time, to use, in case we didn't think one of us really is one of us. I've never told anyone about this, but I feel like it's time to. Since 2017, life has been pretty hectic. My maternal grandma had lung cancer and had to get rid of half of one of her lungs. My mum's only brother also had cancer that had spread throughout his entire body, and unfortunately the chemo couldn't do anything and he passed away. One of my paternal uncles, who had been sick his whole life with situs inversus, severe asthma and cardiac problems, died of a stroke. My paternal grandma also died of a stroke, and now my maternal grandma has cancer again and is showing signs of dementia. If I'm writing here today, it's because I've noticed something really weird, and hopefully one of you have had the same experience and can help me. It happened the first time on October 19th, 2018, aka the day my maternal uncle died. I was still in high school at the time, and I was in town with my best friend having lunch. This particular day I was feeling really down, just like how you would feel if your uncle was dying, you might say. But no, it was a lot worse than that, and was for no apparent reason. I just brushed it off, acted like it was nothing and went to school. During class right before lunch I had some kind of breakdown. I felt like crying but tried not to, as I didn't want to draw attention to myself. Class ended and my teacher asked to talk to me. I summed up the whole situation to her before leaving with my best friend. She asked if I was sure I wanted to go out. I said yes, and I didn't want to worry my mum by going home early. Little did I know at the time, though, that my mum had had to rush to the hospital because her brother was in his last moments of life. But I didn't know any of this, and she didn't want to tell me until the day was over. It happened that same day. I was going to the theatre for some play with my friends, and I don't really remember any of the play, to be honest, but I just had this feeling of absolute worry and felt like something had happened. Eventually the play ended and my parents came to pick me up, which is weird because my dad never comes with my mum to pick me up, so I could tell they had been crying, and I immediately understood the situation. We went home and there was my brother, his girlfriend and my cousin, my uncle's son. I couldn't really react when they told me what had happened. Maybe because I felt something was up. I don't know. Moving on to July the 13th, 2019. You have to know that I live in the very north of France, and my dad's family live in the very south of Spain. It was a Saturday at the very beginning of summer break, and neither of my parents were working that day. My dad was watching Netflix in bed, and I was watching TV with my mum in the living room. I wasn't feeling good that day. I was down and had a very bad night. I felt like crying all day long for no reason. So I tried to act as if nothing was up because there was no reason to be feeling like that. Now my uncle had been sick all of his life and was now at the grand age of 63, which was a lot for him because doctors had told my grandma he wouldn't have survived a year when he was born. He'd had situs inversus, which means his heart was on the right side and all his organs were on the wrong side. He had severe asthma and had to carry an oxygen bottle everywhere with him, and he had heart problems. He had lived most of his life with my grandma because of how dangerous it had been for him to live alone, and since I was a little girl, I had always heard my dad say my uncle could die at any moment because of how bad his situation was. That day we could hear my dad speaking Spanish on the phone, and suddenly we see him coming downstairs, sobbing and telling us his brother had passed away. I immediately threw up from the shock, but then remembered how I was feeling and how I had felt the same way for my maternal uncle. Fast forward to October 21st, 2019. I'd had a horrible night as I couldn't sleep and woke up with a horrible migraine because of it. I went home after just 2 hours of class because of how bad it was. I called my mum when I got home and she suddenly told me that my grandma had had a stroke and my dad is on his way to Spain. I was beyond devastated because as she was 89, there wasn't much hope for recovery. It was a Wednesday and I got home the next day. On Friday at 6:30 a.m. I woke up sweating and short of breath, and I couldn't calm myself down. I stayed in bed until 9, and when I got up, my mum was sitting in the kitchen and had just gotten off of the phone with my dad. Grandma had passed at 6:40 a.m. I don't want to say that I can predict death because it sounds absurd, but I do believe I can feel something when someone is dying. So if anyone has had a similar experience or knows anything that could explain this, I would love to hear from you. This is just one experience amongst a few, from days when we lived in a particularly paranormally active house. The activity we normally had there was pretty cliché. Voices, scratching, drawers opening, footsteps, banging and shadow people. We also weren't allowed to have any electronic toys as kids because they turn on their own at night. It was the typical stuff basically, but many of us had experiences that were kind of exclusive to us, as if there was actually a large number of spirits present that would bother different people in the house. Anyway, this is a retelling of one of those beasts that targeted me in particular. It's important to know that as a kid I didn't have my own bed, so I'd often sleep with my mother on the floor next to her bed, on the couch, or my brother's spare bunk bed before the rickety thing broke down. So of course my mother kept an eye out for cheap beds. Eventually she found one for $20. Way too cheap for a full twin-size bed mattress, drawers, all in perfect condition. And of course she got it from some yard sale at a sketchy church we'd never attended before. I still remember walking into that place, and the feeling of heaviness and fear washed over me, like I was being watched very closely. The same feeling I would get at home. So she brought this bed home, and I was very excited to finally have my own bed to sleep in. No more sleeping on the floor to make room for my mum's boyfriends. It was a dream, but I soon came to realize that every time I slept on that bed, I would have nightmares. Strange nightmares that I'd never had before. There seemed to be two different kinds that would happen on this bed. It first started with deathly silent dreams of just walking around the house at night. It would be empty of any people, and everything had a monochromatic blue hue to it, with a weird sort of mist or fog everywhere. It was strange because I'd often dreamed of the house before, but never accurately. In these dreams the house was exactly the way it was in real life. Then came the dreams that truly scared me, the void ones. I would be in pitch black darkness, total nothingness, but I would be conscious. Then a human-like creature would appear in the middle of this black void. The creature seemed to be a very short little man with pointed ears, a giant eggplant-shaped nose, and a disgusting grin that would show sharp, shark-like teeth. He would always just sit there, staring at me with this putrid grin on his face, and sometimes he'd be laughing. Eventually he'd stand up, then the dreams progressed to him walking around, looking at me as if he was mocking me. My uncle gave me a golden cross necklace with Jesus on it, as a gift I guess, because he was worried about the dreams and my talking to a boy who wasn't there around the same time as well. But somehow on this particular day, I think I was at school, and it was that fact that terrified me the most. This thing, whatever it was, had somehow managed to follow me somewhere outside of my bed. I saw him once again in a dream, first time since I put on the necklace, but this time instead of just watching and mocking me from a distance, he'd actually walked right up to me, raised his arm and did a sort of pinching motion with his fingers right in front of my face. I was completely terrified and confused as to what he was doing and why. I didn't find out until later when I'd gotten home that my mother had noticed that the thick solid metal cross of Jesus that my uncle had given to me had the two arms folded inwards, as if someone had squeezed them together. I recall my family struggling to undo the fold with pliers after this ordeal. After this I refused to sleep in that bed at all. I didn't even want to sleep at all until that bed was gone. My mother finally gave in and tossed the bed out, and since she had, my dreams went back to normal, and I never saw that wretched demon again. It still gives me chills to this day on how he was able to get me in kindergarten. As if he could still find me and was out there looking for me. I just wish I knew what that thing was. What would have happened if we'd never gotten rid of that bed, and I had kept sleeping in it? Would he have gotten even stronger, or followed me forever perhaps? I honestly don't know, but I'm glad it's all over, and I hope that I never have to see that thing ever again. This happened a few summers ago. I wouldn't call it spooky so much as it was strange. My family and I have a little vacation home in the woods. It lies relatively secluded from civilization, as we have a plot of forest surrounding the house. There's a path leading up to the house from the dirt road that is in turn connected to the main road. Along that dirt road lies the neighbouring houses, most of them about a 10-minute walk apart. What I'm about to tell you happened during the afternoon, in broad daylight. We had a heat wave that week that left us frying in the sun on a daily basis. It was so warm that you just didn't feel like doing much at all. My mum had gone to take a nap to escape the heat and left my brother and I sitting outside in the shade. I was 19 at the time and my brother 15, so it wasn't as though she couldn't leave us on our own. We were having a nonsensical conversation and battling boredom when I caught movement from the path leading up to the house. Since everyone in the area was aware, these grounds are private property, it was rare that we got unannounced visitors. The trees thinned out enough that a good portion of the path was visible, so I had clear sight on a family of 4 calmly strolling up to our house, as though they owned the place. I remember mistaking them for family friends upon first glance, until they got a bit closer. I only got a quick look before I got to wake my mum. I figured they might know her, which could be the reason they approached the house so confidently. The house isn't big, so I was standing in my mum's room within a second, and we were outside the next. I really couldn't have been gone longer than 10 seconds or so, and there was still a man approaching, but the 3 other people I was sure I had seen were nowhere. I looked up the path behind him and saw no one hanging back or walking the other way. He was alone. He seemed like a friendly guy, and I remember taking in all these vague details about him. The torn fabric of his shoe, his wedding ring, the binoculars that hung from a strap around his shoulder. He introduced himself to us and said he lived a few houses over, and he had come to ask us about the gate we had just renovated because he was looking to replace his. It didn't occur to me to ask where the rest of his family had gone, but it did puzzle me. When he'd left, I'd asked my brother where he thought they could have gone. He looked at me confused and asked, "Who?" I told him the 2 boys and the woman I had seen walk alongside the man, the boys being about 8 to 10 years old, I think, wearing white clothes and light blue hats, and then a woman wearing a white sundress. I had seen them from a distance, but I knew for sure the man hadn't worn any white. White isn't exactly a natural colour in the woods. In that split second, I even thought I recognised them, so I know I didn't make it up. Why else would something like that happen to me? My brother said he hadn't seen anyone but the man. My mum's only explanation was that the man might have told the rest of his family to turn back so that they wouldn't all suddenly be standing in front of our door, but I can't imagine the 3 of them could have walked back so fast that I couldn't see them making their way back further down the path. I had only been inside for a few seconds. The man had given us his number so we could connect him with the people that built our fence. My curiosity isn't great enough for me to call and ask him whether he'd come to our house alone or not, and I haven't heard anything from him anymore. I doubt he even remembers us, and it's been a few years. He might not even live there anymore. It still baffles me that I know for sure I saw 3 people that apparently didn't exist. This is the only paranormal experience I have ever had, and I don't have a history of seeing things like this, so I really wonder whether the heat caused my mind to play tricks on me, or if I actually saw something that I can't explain that day.
fast train, I don't want her here. Just come and take away the problem that's been treating me like a fool. Oh yeah, fast